help run the Southeast Europe project here, and here to introduce our topic today. Many of us have been probably following the events of late in Cyprus. Earlier in August, the ECO pulled out of the coalition government, leaving Akel on its own. Protests to the Mari explosion were calling for President Christofias to step down, and for the first time in over half a century of the Republic's history, there's a call for early elections. The fiscal and economic conditions created by the blast and its damage to the island's main power plant added to its strapped economic situation as Cyprus is struggling with its own economic calamity and possibly looking to Russia, we now see, as one of its lenders. Reports last week stated Cyprus was close to an agreement of a $2.5 billion euro emergency loan from Russia. We don't know yet if that's actually gone through, but along with Greece, Spain, Portugal, and a host of other countries, Cyprus has seen its credit ratings cut. There's fear that Greece's economic meltdown may be spreading across the Mediterranean. And on Monday, Cyprus announced it will start drilling in what is now becoming known as Block 12 in its agreement with Israel, despite warnings from Turkey as being seen as an act of provocation. And Prime Minister Erdogan has reportedly stated that Turkey will monitor developments with frigates, gunboats, and its air force. Drilling is taking place in what Cyprus claims as their exclusive economic zone, but Turkey claims that the natural resources around Cyprus belong to both the Turkish and Greek sectors, and that any development project should be shelved until the dispute over the political status of the island is resolved. The EU, as well as the UN, urged the parties to focus on a comprehensive solution to the political dispute, and Turkey has threatened to freeze relations with the EU if reunification hasn't been agreed upon before Cyprus takes over the EU presidency, slated for July of next year. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has reiterated his expectation that the two sides should move the negotiation process forward to come up with concrete measures during this current intensified phase of discussions and prior to the Secretary General's next scheduled meeting with the leaders of both sides at the end of October. So we have here today our speaker, Farid Mirbagheri. You've all received, before I get to that, I have to thank our partner here, Strategy International, and Dr. Marios Epthimiopoulos for helping us to put this together. But you've all received the bio for our speaker. I'm just going to touch on a couple things. He's currently a professor of international relations and the holder of the Dialogue Chair in Middle Eastern Studies and International Relations at the University of Nicosia in Cyprus. He assumed the editorship of the Cyprus Review, the leading internationally refereed academic journal on Cypriot affairs at the University of Nicosia. And he currently serves as a member of the editorial board of the journal. He is the co-founder and executive director of the Diplomatic Academy in Cyprus, which is affiliated with the University of Nicosia, whose main function is the training of younger Cypriot diplomats. His writings have included books, numerous journals, articles, and book chapters. One is a historical dictionary of Cyprus, which is his second major work on Cyprus, published by Scarecrow Press in 2009. And his latest work, War and Peace in Islam, a critique of Islam's political discourse, is due out by Palgrave later this year. So without further ado, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Orfanidis. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here at such prestigious institute. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center, Mrs. Orfanidis, and Dr. Epthimiopoulos for facilitating this visit. I understand that many of you around the table are yourselves quite familiar, in fact, experts on the Cyprus situation, which makes speaking rather difficult. Nevertheless, I'll give my talk an outline of some developments on the island, and we'll address questions and comments if there are any afterwards. To begin with, Cyprus economy, which some have suggested may go down the same route as the Greek economy. The GDP of Cyprus is around $25 billion, which makes its GDP per capita something in the region of $23,000. Economically, Cyprus had recession. Its economy contracted in 2009 by just under 2%, but that was recovered the year later as the economy began to expand. So there is no recession at the moment. But there is a budget deficit well above the criteria set by the European Union. The budget deficit, which stands at 5.3%, and the criteria set by the European Union is 3%.
At the end. We'll have time for questions at the end. Sorry.
No, this is to do with the sort of government of Cyprus. Yes, this is the south. Yes. That's so. There is the biggest worry was the public debt by the government, which well over 50% of its GDP, and some of this debt's about to mature early next year. That has been the main point of concern. There's unemployment of over 7%, which is the highest I remember in Cyprus for many years. Inflation is not so high, as there are no reliable figures for this year yet, but last year was said to be around 2.4%, but this year is bound to be more than that. Tourism, though, is up, so they say. It's 5% in terms of number of visitors and 17% in terms of revenues. And of course, problems in the region with Arab Spring, Egypt, North Africa. It means that more visitors will visit Cyprus instead of going to other resorts. Traditionally, Cyprus has benefited from such turmoil. The Lebanese civil war, for instance, again, meant that many people chose Cyprus as a destination for holiday. So overall, how I should say that Cyprus economy fares rather well compared to others that are in trouble. The economy of Cyprus since 2000 has grown higher than the average in the European Union. And therefore, some economists say that the problems about Cyprus are slightly exaggerated by the credit rating agencies. We must not forget it's a pretty small economy. We are not in any measure talking about the kind of Greek debt, which is nearly $200 billion. We're talking nothing like that. It's much lower than that. Which brings me to the banking sector in Cyprus. Again, the problems, if they're in trouble, the banking sector in Cyprus is not comparable to what, for instance, we saw in the UK, when the government had to inject hundreds of billions of pounds into the banking system to keep them afloat when there was a problem. In fact, the banks in Cyprus are bigger than government. The amount of deposits in the banks is 3 times the GDP of the country. We have around 70 billion euros deposits in the banks, 20 billion of which coming from abroad. And save the last quarter, they have been steadily increasing. Bank of Cyprus, which is the main bank on the island, government has shares in this bank, recently took over a medium-sized Russian bank. Some say large, I would say medium-sized Russian bank. And the owner of that bank, in return, took over 10% of the shares of the Bank of Cyprus. So there is close cooperation between now Russian and Cypriot financial institutions. Now, about Greece, the total amount of Greek debt that Cyprus banks hold is around 5 billion euros, which is, if you imagine they have 70 billion deposits, and they have 5 billion, even if they have to write it off completely, is manageable. Of course, dividends will suffer as a result of this if it happens and they have to write it off, but it's not going to bankrupt them. Particularly so that the government, the central bank of Cyprus, does not allow the banks to lend anything more than 30% of their holdings. So there has to be liquidity of at least 70%. So in that sense, it is unlikely we are going to see a panic and a lack of funds in the banking sector in Cyprus. Banks are also highly regulated. They cannot invest the money anywhere in any business other than very closely related business like insurance. Banks are not allowed to go into property business or other. There have been one or two exceptions when bigger banks have invested once or twice in property, but by and large, the central bank does not allow investment by banks into other unrelated ventures. That having been said, the economic crisis in Greece and the amount of public debt by Cyprus had applied pressure on government to adopt tight fiscal policies. The Minister of Economics at the time was rather dismissive of the pessimism of economists and stressed that the economy was in good shape, particularly after the banks in Cyprus passed a stress test and a clean bill of health given to them. But that all changed on 11th of July 2011 when an explosion took place at Mari ammunition depot, and some have suggested it was the biggest peacetime explosion in the world since the Second World War. People 40 miles away heard the explosion and woke up. It was, we still don't know exact details, but some nearly 2,000 tons of explosives. How much of it actually exploded, we don't know. As a result of that, 13 people, in a way it's very fortunate, only 13. 13 people lost their lives. The biggest power plant that had just been completed on the island was completely knocked out. And a financial cost estimated of around 1.5 billion euros was added to the bill. Why did this, just briefly, why did this explosion happen? It's important in order to understand the consequences of Mari explosion and the pressure that government has been under. Some 2 years ago, a ship with a cargo of explosives originated from Iran towards Syria. The United States intercepted and stopped under UN sanctions, stopped the ship. It was in Cyprus waters. Cyprus took over and against the advice, I think, or the wishes of the United States, decided to deal with the cargo itself. And it stored it in a naval base place called Mari. And after 2 years, the explosion took place. Now, the questions that are being asked are, why were they stored in such poor conditions? You have 2,000 tons of explosives in containers. 2 years in open, in this heat of Cyprus, which in August, over 40 degrees, 45 degrees. Why do you store such explosives in such poor conditions? That's the question many people are asking. Second, why did you store them next to a power plant, the biggest power plant on the island, which produces more than 50% of the power? Usually, ammunition, I'm not a military man, but my understanding is that ammunition are usually stored somewhere quite distant from any centers and maybe underground, rather than next to important centers of industry or population. And thirdly, why did the government refuse the help of the United States or understand European powers, Britain, France and Germany? It was written that they also offered their services to Cyprus to dispose of the cargo in a safe way. Why? Both politically and administratively, the government has been under pressure to provide answers. Speculation is that because President Christofias is supported by AKEL, which is the left party, the very left party of Cyprus, it played a part. The ideological politics of the party played a part because it did not wish to harm its relations with either Syria or Iran. Since the explosions, a lot of claims and counterclaims have been made by politicians that the former foreign minister, Kyprianou, states that President Christofias had promised Bashar Assad that the cargo would be kept safe and at the end given to Syria, and there have been counterclaims by Presidential Palace that this was not so, and that the president was in fact unaware of the depot and the conditions in which they were kept. The inquest is still going on. But the immediate consequences were that the defense minister resigned. He had stated some time back before the explosion that the explosives were so safe that they could be stored in the middle of residential areas. And the head of National Guard, he also resigned. And then the whole cabinet. The most important, perhaps, of all was the resignation of the former foreign minister, Marcos Kyprianou, because he mainly represented the coalition party, TICO, who was in collaboration with AKEL, part of government. Now, their departure from the party means AKEL is now almost ruling on its own, without the support of other parties. This is possible because in Cyprus is a presidential system, so the president can rule without support of other parties. But it makes political life very difficult. There are now two inquests, one in public. Actually, the president was grilled by the investigator whom was appointed by himself in public, and people were shouting unpleasant things at him in the open while being televised. And there is one which is taking place by the Attorney General. There have been repeated demonstrations by thousands outside the presidential palace for the resignation of the president. And of course, this has brought about extra financial burden on an already difficult situation economically. Government is now taking austerity measures seriously. It's going to revise the civil service, the pension system. In the current way they're very expensive. Some former civil servants, retired civil servants, get 3 different pensions from government. And there has now been a freeze on public recruitment and extra taxes that are now being levied. I will not leave the economy, I'll come back to it later, and move on to the question of Cyprus talks. But I should say that, last thing, I do not believe President Christofias is going to resign. Resignation for him is not an option. He's going to hang on to the very last. The state of the talks, there are 6 chapters, 6 headings under which talks take place. There is governance and power sharing, there is economic and EU matters, there is territorial issues, there is property, there is citizenship, and there is security and guarantees. The easiest one for them, the governance and power sharing, and economic and EU matters, they have by and large been agreed upon. Apart from one little difference which came of late, there had been also agreement on cross-voting in a federal Cyprus, but now I understand the leader of Turkish Cypriots has withdrawn that concession and does not want cross-voting. On territorial issues, it is unresolved, but the plan is that 2/3 of Greek Cypriot refugees would be able to live under Greek Cypriot federated state, whilst Turkish Cypriots retain 27% of the territory, which is somewhat close to what they have now, slightly less to what they have now. On citizenship and settlers, this question of settlers, that a number of people whom have arrived from Turkey and have settled in Cyprus, northern Cyprus. The government, which is Greek Cypriot, wants to discuss a maximum number allowed, a ceiling. Whereas Turkish Cypriots want to discuss the criteria for citizenship altogether. Is obviously the second one Greek Cypriots feel would leave the door open for more and more number of non-indigenous Cypriots becoming citizens of Cyprus. And Turkish Cypriots feel putting a limit on that, it's just would mean many of Turkish who are now Turkish Cypriots in the north, but originally Turks from Turkey, would have to return. Security and guarantee is the most difficult issue, the treaty of guarantee and the security. And they have left that for the last. They said it's the most difficult one, so we'll leave it as the last thing. And they have agreed that it would be discussed and hopefully resolved in an international conference, this particular issue. But on these 6 chapters, apart from 2, the other 4, there seems quite a long way to go at the moment. The position of Turkish Cypriot negotiators has hardened since the election into office of Mr. Eroglu in place of Mr. Mehmet Ali Talat, who was more amenable to a settlement, it seems. Perhaps, in retrospect, what President Christofias could have done, and he didn't do, and some people found that very disappointing, is that during Turkish Cypriot leadership elections, President Christofias could have highlighted the agreements reached with former Turkish Cypriot leader in order to boost the image that Mr. Talat held amongst Turkish Cypriots. Could have helped him in being perhaps re-elected, but President Christofias decided at all not to say or do anything. There is another problem, a huge stumbling block now, you may say, in reaching a settlement. Ironically, that is the Annan Plan. Why? It's because in 2004, the plan was accepted by Turkish Cypriots. It was rejected by Greek Cypriots. Akel was a party that rejected the Annan Plan. Now, President Christofias, representing Akel in government, can he possibly come up or sign an agreement that is less than the Annan Plan? Obviously not. Particularly when he's in such a weak position domestically. When his former partners now have pulled out of government. And equally, can a Turkish Cypriot leader possibly offer anything less than the Annan Plan to Turkish Cypriots and expect it to go through? So the benchmark has now become for both communities the Annan Plan. They are going to compare immediately any settlement with what was offered to them in 2004. It appears unlikely that the Cyprus problem may be resolved in the remainder of the President Christofias' at least first term in office. If he runs for office again or is re-elected, remains to be seen. There is a need for a lot of political goodwill. President Christofias, I think he genuinely wants a solution, but he's too weak, I think, to offer anything more domestically to be able to sell that agreement to his own people. And we do not see goodwill in sufficient measure from the other side, from the Turkish Cypriot side. The perceived gains may appear less than possible losses. Internationally also, there does not seem to be an urgency or a momentum of the kind we saw in 2004 to push for a settlement. Now, there are three things that provide some kind of relief for Cyprus and for the Cypriot leader. The first, as was mentioned in the beginning, a loan to the amount of 2.5 billion euros from Russian government to government. We do not know the terms of these loans. It has now been almost confirmed because even when the question was put to government spokesman, he did not deny it. But the rates of interest and terms of repayment are not known. But it will provide some relief, no doubt. Second is the European Union presidency, and obviously Cyprus will be the center stage then for 6 months or so, which again may ease off the pressure on President Christofias, and he will find some space in that. But perhaps the most important is the prospect of oil and gas. It is reported that something to the degree of the exact figure I have seen, 288 billion cubic meters of gas in Block 12, and there are other blocks which we do not know. We don't know about gas, is in Block 12, which belongs to Cyprus. The most conservative estimates put the revenue for Cyprus of at least 500 million euros a year for 30 years. As you know, an American company, Noble, won the bid for the drilling, has started drilling. Again, the terms and conditions agreements with Noble is confidential. Even when Parliament asked government to tell parliamentary committee the terms and conditions, government refused. But it's definitely in the midterm to long term, it will bring a lot of relief for Cyprus. And the next government in Cyprus, which we elected in 2013, should find it easier for itself with the money of the oil and gas coming in. In fact, if you were a member of opposition in Cyprus now, you would not want to take over immediately. You would want to take over in a couple of years. So you would not be dealing with these austerity measures and be held responsible for all that. Cyprus can become an energy hub, a place through which not just Cyprus energy can be transported to the rest of the world, to Europe, but Israeli, maybe Lebanese, and other countries, Egyptian, through Cyprus, would be able to store their energy, liquefy it, and then transport it to Europe. We've already seen a huge traffic between Tel Aviv and Nicosia. We're witnessing it. It's getting closer and closer to cooperation between them. One of the reasons that perhaps some people suggest Ankara is anxious about this is that with the apparent rift between Tel Aviv and Ankara, now are we going to see Israel becoming closer to Cyprus? And would, if that were to happen, would that strategic alliance undermine Turkish position in the area in any shape or form? Geographically, Cyprus is in most privileged position to benefit from this energy exploration. It is a member of the European Union. It is trusted by its Arab neighbors. It has good relations with Israel. And it's in the middle of intersection of 3 continents. It's ideally located and politically suitable to be the place through which this energy is stored and transported to the rest of the world. So I think President Christofias is counting a lot on this. And that is one reason he's given go-ahead ASAP to Noble to drill and start the process. In the absence of a likelihood for a settlement, under huge domestic pressure because of the explosion in Mari, which killed 13 innocent people, and with huge economic, I would say that in quotation marks, huge economic crisis, he wishes to leave, I think, a more positive legacy from himself. And oil and gas provide that for him. That despite threats posed by outsiders, despite difficulties in the way, he pressed ahead with this and it paid off. One or two words at the end I'd like to say about the rift between Israel and Turkey and Cyprus's position. Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so they say. And now with the distance widening apparently between Turkey and Israel, Cyprus may feel it has more to gain from closer alliance with Israel. But a word of caution here, and that is, and some Israeli politicians have themselves stated this, that, I mean, they have problems with Turkey now, but that will be resolved. Turkey's distance from Israel also gives it a lot of space vis-a-vis its Arab neighbors. When Erdogan goes to Egypt and asks Islamic Brotherhood and others to vote for a secular government, and, well, people listen, some disagree, some may agree. They don't view him as an ally of Israel. Were they to view him as an ally of Tel Aviv, they wouldn't be listening to him, maybe, in the first place. Turkey is very much aware of that. I don't think Turkey is shifting its security coordinates in any substantive shape or form. It's committed to Western security framework. It's agreed to the defense shield only recently. And its distance now with Israel has its own dividends, which makes it possible for Turkish policymakers to have a say or have influence in the developments that are now affecting almost all the countries in the region. So it may be also tactical and not entirely strategic. And I think Cyprus would be well advised to bear that in mind and not view this rift between Turkey and Israel as permanent. My last word is that Cyprus has been in the middle of, or historically it has been conquered, ruled by East-West. And since independence, it has actually tried to be so-called the man of all seasons, to be part of, it is in the Western sphere of influence. Britain has 2 sovereign bases there. It is a member of the European Union. At the same time, it has kept close ties with countries that were not so friendly to the West. It has, in a way, paid at least lip service to the Palestinians. Well, maybe its position dictates such brinkmanship, but they have to be careful. It's a delicate game, it's a subtle game, and if not played carefully, it can also be dangerous. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll now open up the floor to questions. Please wait for the microphones and announce yourselves with your name and affiliation before asking your question. Anyone? He's answered everything? Okay, there we go.
Yes. Have you considered the possibility of optional dual citizenship and a buffer zone?
Dual citizenship for Cypriots?
If you had a dual citizenship, you could vote in both elections, have it a double election?
This, not dual citizenship, but cross-voting, yes, that Greek Cypriots could vote in Turkish Cypriot elections, and it would be weighted. They would only count, let's say, for 20% of the total vote, and Turkish Cypriots also the same in Greek Cypriot. And it was accepted about, I think, January 2010, if I'm not mistaken. However, now Turkish Cypriot leadership claims it was not written, it was more verbal, and I'm told that when it was brought up again and again by Greek Cypriots, they said, "Oh, let's show us the paper. Where did we agree to this?" And now they have stated their disagreement with that.
The part of this I was thinking most of was, if you had a buffer zone, you could give advantage to the people that were in dual citizenship to live in the buffer zone, loans and that kind of thing, and also that the buffer zone will be in Morpho. Morpho will be in the buffer zone.
As you know, there is a buffer zone at the moment.
Oh, there is?
There is a buffer zone which runs across the island. Is manned mainly by the UN. Some Cypriots who have farms and they work there, supervised and patrolled by the United Nations. But the idea is, for a solution, has never been to have a solution and keep the buffer zone.
The reason I'm saying that is it might be something that people with cross-voting could agree with the people that we must separate entirely. It was just an idea.
Yes, right. No, I mean, it's cross-voting, but in the sense that it would allow interest by Turkish Cypriots in Greek Cypriot elections and vice versa. So both communities would have something to gain in following the events and developments in the other federated states.
Any other questions? Gentleman here.
Yep.
Okay.
Hi. I'm Olympia Claus. I'm from the Embassy of Cyprus. I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on Turkey's willingness to be constructive in the negotiations, taking into account Prime Minister Erdogan's statement on the 20th of July for a two-state solution?
Well, as you said, in view of the United Nations asking for intensive talks to reunify the island, I think some of the statements made by Prime Minister Erdogan do not appear particularly helpful. He also I think, mentioned that in the talks no amount of territory should be given away by Turkish Cypriots to Greek Cypriots, which is not something agreed upon. I mean, it was already understood that some of the land currently in the Turkish Cypriot sector would have to be given up to the Greek Cypriot side. So some of the recent statements by Prime Minister Erdogan do not seem particularly helpful in this regard, yes.
We had a question here, the gentleman.
Thank you. There had been, and I
Your
suppose,
name.
Leonard Oberlander. There was a office of the title was something to the effect, the Office of the Cyprus Question, and it was dealing with the politics and logistics and so forth of that issue. And that was in Greek Cyprus. Does that office still exist? And if so, what is its role in this?
Yes, that office, I think, it has been expanded. My understanding is that it covers. It is not just one office that deals with the Cyprus problem. A number of departments deal with the Cyprus issue. And there isn't one person in charge. There is the head of diplomatic office of the president, who is a senior diplomat of the ministry, but actually stationed at the presidential palace. His office is there. And he oversees a lot of this. But yes, when I first started dealing with the issue of Cyprus some 25 years ago, that was the case, and it remained for some time quite the same. It has changed somewhat.
We have Ambassador Miller there, and then we have a question here.
Let's just pretend that we're a year later in this country. We used to have a big effort devoted toward the Cyprus negotiations, and we don't have much now. And let's just pretend that, well, we won't even say who's elected. Someone's elected as the next president, maybe President Obama, maybe Republican. Two questions. Should the U.S. be more involved? And related to that, what kind of role could it play? And is the UN process, I know Ban Ki-moon makes statements, but is it essentially dead?
If I may start from the second question and move on to the first. I think if I may choose the phrase, not dead, but just living. Yeah, something like that. It's. I don't think anyone expects anything in the next 18 months to come out of Cyprus talks. I think this is endemic. Everybody shares that view. On the first question, how the United States could contribute, I think the United States has always had a keen interest, and as Ambassador Miller yourself were a negotiator by the US government, which has helped, because if you feel the peace process enjoys the support of the most powerful country in the world, obviously you treat the peace process differently. If the United States now were to disengage and say, all right, guys, we've given it a good go, we tried, now, okay, left yourselves. They may interpret that as a sign that the United States has no interest in a solution. So in a way, as I'm sure, you may appreciate the support and the presence of the United States, both behind the scenes and both in public, itself symbolically and substantively is required if ever a solution is to be achieved.
We have one more here, and then we'll get to there.
My name is Nevzer Stacy. I'm the president of Hasna Incorporated. We've been doing work in North and South Cyprus for reunification for 12 years. And I was there, and I have a really serious question to ask your opinion on. It's the Turkish immigrants who have come to the island. It's been 30, 40 years they're there, and they have children and so forth. The two options that is on the table, the maximum number or the criteria, which one would you recommend and what your reasons are?
It is true, it is accepted in the world that there was a time, even I lived in the UK most of my life. In the UK there used to be, I don't know if it exists, a law that if someone stays in the UK for 14 years, even illegally, after 14 years they ought to be granted residency rights. Yeah, I don't know if that has changed. It may very well have changed. It is true that if you stay in a land and you establish a family and your work, and you just cannot take people, uproot them, say no, go back. That having been said, Cyprus is a small country. Is smaller than even a small percentage of one of the states of the United States. It's a pretty small country. And the demography of the land matters to people. I can understand the argument that you have to grant human rights to everyone, even if they were brought up with false promises, if they're brought from other countries, different situations. But at the same time, I understand that you have to infuse that with a degree of pragmatism and in a way that would not upset completely the demographic coordinates of the land. So it has to be strike a balance in between. I mean, you play with the criteria a bit, but at the same time, you set a number.
Ambassador Don Bandler. There we go. So I was ambassador for 3 years in Cyprus and came back several times. And I think the conversation here is a thoughtful one. So just a couple of points. The economy has always been a critical matter for Cyprus, and it has done reasonably well at times, and it has, on the other hand, kind of lost its way in various other eras, not eras, but other times and places. The petroleum issue that you raised, and not just you, but people around the table, I think, is an exceptionally important element for Cyprus to really thrive. And then, when we get back to the Turkey issue, because it's always been scratchy at the minimum. I mean, because there's fear about Turkey. It's a much stronger army, and it's 5 minutes away from, if we remember back 20 or 30 years ago, where aircraft were taken out in Cyprus. We had we also flipped in Cyprus for some years. It used to be that the Turkish Cypriots were on the southern side, and that flipped. So it's a country that has gone through a lot of things, and so I guess my my point is that the United States, the EU, Obama today, it would be nice if Obama could add something to this. I don't know if that will be the case or not, but it's important enough in that region to try to pull it back into some of its better days. And let's hope that that would happen.
I echo your sentiments, Ambassador. Quite, yeah, very much.
Are there any? Oh, right here, and then we'll get.
Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Ultimately, it boils down to an agreement between the two communities on the island, right, to come to terms with the situation. And we were pretty close, but it didn't work. Can you give us a sense whether maybe a sort of mediation, by the way, maybe not between the big powers, not US, not necessarily the European Union, but people who might not be that, powerful, but who have trust on both sides? Can you figure out, can you see someone who would be able to generate that sort of trust, on the two sides and in order to move things forward?
Thank you. I see Cyprus problems with two dimensions, internal and external. The two communities must come to an agreement, and key outside players must come to an agreement. It used to be thought in the past that is the work of the outsiders. They created the problem, and whenever they want, they can resolve the problem. 2004 disproved that, because outside powers came to an agreement, pushed it, 2004, but it was the communities that rejected it. I mean, one. There may be a mediation process and a mediator or mediators, group of mediators, who can bring about a kind of settlement. But that should not overlook the external element. The position of Turkey, Greece, United Kingdom has 2 bases and other facilities on the island. If there is a process that addresses both internal and external elements in Cyprus, like Resolution 186 of Security Council in 1964 did, both elements can be brought together. Yes, there's a chance. But it would be difficult to bring about the two at the same time. So other than government, my understanding is that the agreement between Palestinians and Israelis celebrated in the White House was initially initiated by a non-politician, non-practitioner, Norwegian, if my understanding is correct. Yes, so there is, if such a difficult conflict can actually be, a process can be initiated by non-practitioners, non-diplomats, non-governments. I'm sure the same can happen about Cyprus. But as long as the external element is not overlooked, it's very important.
I'm not affiliated with any organization. I'm just an interested bystander. I'm kind of curious about, you were talking to some small extent about, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
About the relationship between Israel, Cyprus, and Turkey. And you said there was a concern that if there's a Turkish-Israeli reconciliation, that the Cypriots would be somewhat concerned about that. Maybe I misunderstood you. But I was kind of curious. What was the relationship between Israel and Cyprus when there was warm relations between Israel and Turkey? And what makes you think there will be a reconciliation between the Israelis and Turks? And how would that affect Cyprus?
Yes, I think what I was trying to say was that now with the distance growing between Turkey and Israel, Cyprus may see an opportunity in forming a strategic alliance with Israel, which comes, of course, also on the back of this energy cooperation that they're having. Why do I think that this may not be permanent? Because I think Turkey, security-wise, it's committed. It's a member of NATO. It's the only Muslim country of NATO. Israel is also, I think, securely or firmly anchored in the West. I think they have different spheres of influence. I mean, Turkey wants to expand its spheres of influence amongst the Islamic countries. Israel doesn't have that ambition. For Turkey to achieve that, it must distance itself from Israel to a degree. But I think substantively, I mean, apart from the flotilla and the tragic deaths of people on the boat, substantively, so far, there hasn't been any major shift in Turkey's orientation that would make me think they would have, they would come actually into permanent kind of state of conflict with Israel. They may appear, they may agree to disagree on a lot of things, I think, for a long time to come, which gives room to Turkey to maneuver in the Islamic world, and so be it, that's fine. But that does not translate into necessarily major shifts in coordinates of security for Turkey. And that, for me, I think it's also an important, or maybe the important factor in assessing the rift between Turkey and Cyprus and Israel.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Alfred Farouj. I'm conducting research on peace building in Cyprus at George Mason. It is my understanding that the Turkish Cypriots in the north are now outnumbered by the Turkish people from mainland Turkey. If that is the case, who is actually representing the Turkish Cypriots, and are their aspirations identical with those of the Turkish people? Would the federation not be more or less legalizing the separation and Taksim? And with reference to what you just said about the 14 years residence, does that also apply in the case of occupation or the purposeful changing of demography? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It is difficult to have reliable census on exactly the number of people, migrants from Turkey into Cyprus. It's very true that it has thousands have come. In fact, Cyprus becoming a member of the European Union, ironically, worked against this keeping demography intact, because a lot of Turkish Cypriots who were now could come to the government side south and get a Cyprus passport, a member of the European Union, and they could go and live anywhere in Europe, and many of them did that. So Turkish Cypriots actually left the island, and then you had less Turkish, indigenous Turkish Cypriots in the north. I'm not sure of the percentages. I'm not sure if they're reliable figures. Yes, it's the point I adhere to. I referred to earlier. It's not an ideal situation, and you're not going to get a perfect solution. Not at all. It's got to be as workable as possible, and it will not be ideal. Those people who've come and the minimum number of whom, should stay. But you cannot just ask, I think, for the return of all settlers. It's just is wrong humanely. Somebody who's been there for 20 years, is married, has got family. But it's got to be done in a way that does not distort the demography of the island. If it does have an impact at all, it has to be minimal. So I don't think there is a solution ideal that would address both concerns, both sets of concerns. It has to be a balanced approach, strike in the middle.
Ambassador Bandler, I think you had your hand up. Or
yes.
And we're about to run out of time, so if we can very quickly.
Yeah, I think in a way, just to wind it up from my view, that on various occasions, I remember one with Tom Miller where we tried to pull together 2 or 3 strings, and we went out into off-island conversations and trying to figure out exactly how we can gestate Cyprus into the kind of citizenship and a lovely place to live, and so on and so forth. So it's gone back and forth so many times. But there are some great people who have worked on this issue for many, many years. And I think it would be a good idea now to, especially with the UN coming up, and especially with Obama, because he was really more interested in Turkey than he was in Cyprus. So, there are some things to look at and work on ahead.
Thank you.
Okay. That will do it for our program today. If you would take a minute to just thank our speaker for being here and give him a warm round of applause.